I racked my brains on Monday the 29th of January as I wondered what was really behind the government's sudden desire and urgency to add Algeria to the list of safe countries. I felt really bothered by this. Something just didn't add up. Then the penny dropped, and I was certain I had figured out their real motive, which, in my opinion, is not just about getting the public on side for any upcoming election. The move was too rapid and too out of the blue for that, and it has been abundantly clear thus far they do not care about what their constituents think. Clearly the move also does not indicate a change of heart about immigration. My feeling was that this latest stunt was preempted by something specific and was designed to appease public anger about something that may make them rageful enough to rise up against the establishment. And I ultimately came to the conclusion that this move was to do with the little girl from the Parnell Square stabbings, which were carried out by an Algerian man. Lo and behold, next day my suspicions were confirmed. As Monday night drew to a close, I felt positive we would soon hear bad news about the little girl. The next day I ran my feelings past a couple of people, and not long after one of them sent me a screenshot of a headline saying the poor child had returned to ICU. And so my suspicions were confirmed. This government, in my view, added Algeria to a list of safe countries only because they knew the girl had deteriorated. They officially added Algeria to that list on Tuesday this week, the very same day the press announced news about her. I strongly believe they precipitated the announcement of her return to ICU with an announcement they hoped would quell any public outrage. In this sense, and in fact in every sense, they have treated this human being, this tiny girl, as a thing and not a person. I think they've hoped the public would forget her, and I believe they have suppressed the reality of her condition and her prognosis to protect themselves. I would not be surprised if, in the coming days or the next couple of weeks, we hear even worse news about this child. There is only so long they can keep their charade going, and knowing this, the sudden Algeria move, which came with lots of fanfare and emphasis on it by the media, seems like a calculated one. Of the news, the Irish Independent stated, "The addition of Algeria is a significant move in the government's plans to tackle rising levels of migration to Ireland." Sorry? Excuse me? What plans would they be exactly? Let's not fool ourselves that this is anything more than a game of let's pretend. And we must bear in mind the move has no teeth whatsoever. People from Algeria will still be allowed to arrive and will still have their claims processed, which will probably still take years. In the body of text, it was strongly emphasised that Justice Minister Helen McEntee will endeavour to bring a memo to Cabinet outlining her plan to drive down the rate of asylum applicants who have been seeking accommodation from the state. Please, come on. Since when does she have a plan to drive down the rate of asylum applicants? Since that little girl went back into ICU, that's when. The word plan would indicate this has been taking shape for some time. And if that's the case, then how come, up until a few days ago, the Minister and the government have been utterly steadfast in their practice of opening the door to whoever from wherever? Reading the article felt like I was reading humorous satire, given the government's general attitude on immigration, but I didn't find it amusing. The article seemed like an attempt to cast Miss McEntee in a good light to protect the Justice Minister and the government, protecting them from just how incandescent with rage the public may be about to become over one specific thing, or rather about one specific child. And the day after we were told of her return to ICU, it was also reported that 2 men had been arrested in connection with the so-called Dublin riots that took place after the children were stabbed. It was stressed how much damage was caused, and the impression is given that these people will be made an example of. The timing of these arrests is not a coincidence, surely. It's almost as if they are reminding people there will be repercussions should they decide not to remain calm in the face of any bad news about the young victim's condition. Maybe some of you will think I'm paranoid, and the timing of all the aforementioned is nothing but coincidence. Maybe you will think it's just about elections. But the government have been doing exactly as their overlords want all this time, and that's not about to change. It is probably McEntee and Co.'s hope and ambition to be awarded with big UN or EU jobs in the future, and they likely feel they do not need their current roles for much longer. They also act like they hold nothing but contempt for the Irish people and make it clear that public opinion is utterly irrelevant. and as such there is something about the sudden flick of a switch shift in their tone and attitude that's worthy of suspicion. They are aware that if that child dies, it may have huge repercussions for those in Leinster House. It is also very possible this child is brain dead and has been from the beginning, and they know they won't be able to hide this indefinitely if it is true. There has clearly been a deterioration in her condition, and they don't use this word in the press headlines, but a return to ICU is sadly exactly what that is. The fact it has even been reported she is back in ICU is in and of itself telling. They have been very unwilling to mention this child much at all the last 9 weeks. Are they preparing the public for worse news? Time will tell. Of course, the government and the media deem the public to be stupid and pliable. The aim with the Algeria angle, as I said, appears to be about appeasing growing anger that has the potential to spill out onto the streets, but also it is to create a distraction big enough to detract from her worsening state. Additionally, they hope this move will make it seem as though the government have suddenly seen the error of their ways. They hope that being seen to curb migration from Algeria will quell public outrage when further truths come out about this little girl, which, sadly, I believe, in time they will. Everything this government does is disgusting and immoral, and nothing they do or say is ever as it seems. People are merely pawns or objects, and this little child is no different. And that's all people to them, are pawns and objects, migrants and Irish alike. They didn't wake up in the past few days and say, oh no, we've been letting people in from Algeria when in fact it's a safe place. They've always known it's a generally safe country for the natives of it. They know that we know it. They haven't cared when we've pointed it out. They've stuck the middle finger up at us when we did so. They've known the country has not been engaged in any conflict for decades, nor are its people at risk from their own government. They do also know, however, that there are many, many Islamic terror groups active in Algeria, and therefore they have put our national security at risk. They've put our children at risk, as evidenced by the events in Parnell Square on November 23rd, 2023. And just to say, those terror groups generally do not target the natives. I shall digress at this point to hand out Dunce of the Week award to Social Democrats leader Holly Cairns, who, it has to be said, confidently presents herself as vastly superior to the likes of TD Mattie McGrath, while failing to realise she sounds so stupid sometimes that her thoughts border on dangerous. In criticising the government adding Algeria to the list of safe countries, she said, I'm wondering who Algeria is safe for because the Foreign Affairs website warns against non-essential travel due to the risk of terror attacks in certain areas. Ms Cairns doesn't seem to understand a couple of very important things. The warnings pertain to tourists, and probably more specifically non-Muslim tourists. The travel warning is not meant for natives of the country of Algeria, at least not the 99.1% Muslim population. It is more likely to be dangerous for the tiny number of Christians who live there, of which they make up a minute 0.4% of the population. Algeria is the 9th most dangerous country to be a Christian, but to reiterate, only a tiny number of Christians reside in the country. To be clear, they risk violent persecution, specifically at the hands of those with Islamic faith, and yet Ms Cairns thinks it's a great idea to allow endless numbers of Algerian Muslims to enter the predominantly Christian country of Ireland with no background checks. Ms Cairns fails to understand that the department's warning is not for the people of Algeria. In January 2022, Al-Qaeda did claim responsibility for placing a landmine in Tabasa province, which did kill 5 Algerian citizens. However, they strongly denied they had intended to target Algerian citizens, and this is likely true given Al-Qaeda is generally happy to claim responsibility when they kill non-Muslims. Warnings of the prevalence of kidnappings are also not meant for Algerian natives but are meant for tourists. Instances of kidnappings of civilians have happened, but generally tourists, humanitarian workers, journalists and government officials are most often the primary targets. Ms Cairns does point out that being gay in Algeria is against the law and carries a prison sentence of up to 3 years, and while this is a fair point, those who come to Ireland legitimately claiming persecution for being homosexual will still be able to claim asylum, but will supposedly have their applications fast-tracked, which should surely please Ms Cairns. After all, why would she want people to be languishing for years without having their applications processed. There is no acknowledgement, of course, from Miss Cairns that most Algerians who arrive here will be, on the balance of probabilities, not gay, and therefore we are more likely to be importing the homophobic attitudes and culture that she is denouncing, rather than be saving gay people from their governments. And while there are undoubtedly genuine cases of gay people seeking asylum, there has also been instances where applicants have lied about being gay and have been encouraged to lie by NGOs, I might add. In 2016, a 22-year-old Nigerian asylum seeker, Kenneth Uday, was jailed for just 5 years for raping a woman in Waterford City. The first time Uday applied for asylum, he falsely claimed he was a Christian persecuted by Muslims, and the second time he applied for asylum in Ireland, he falsely claimed he was gay. Lastly, to say the lie of religious persecution is often used, as we've seen here in this case, but the reality is we are statistically more likely to be seeing the arrival of Muslims over Christians in this country, as the people coming in are mostly from predominantly Muslim countries, bar Ukraine and Georgia and a couple of other exceptions. So all in all, Ms Cairns' comments do not hold up. But for now, let's return to the government's suspicious turnaround on Algeria. When Roderick O'Gorman put out his infamous tweet inviting the world to come to Ireland, whereupon they would have their own door accommodation within a few months, he made sure to considerately translate the message into many languages. One of those languages was French. He was not, of course, inviting French people to Ireland, but rather encouraging those from French-speaking countries, such as the predominantly Muslim North African country Algeria, a country that is, if nothing else, vastly different to Ireland in terms of cultural attitudes to women and girls and in terms of religious ideology, as well as different attitudes towards homosexuality, as I've already mentioned. Those who have dared to question why the government have allowed so many in from Algeria have been labelled far-right extremists, racists, xenophobes, and yet overnight the country is suddenly one they're concerned with in terms of assuring the public. We've been pointing to the fact that they're letting people in, and more specifically, unvetted men, from safe countries for a long time now. We've been objecting strongly to large numbers of these men being dumped in hotels, office blocks and industrial units within our communities. We have cried out time and again that our children and women are being put at risk, and we have been told to shut up and put up. We have been told the government has a humanitarian and legal obligation to take these men in come what may. But there's one come what may the government did not bank on, and now they're scared, in my opinion. That come what may is the day they can no longer play the game of pretending this little girl in ICU is going to be okay, and that day has arrived. To anyone who wants to come at me, feel free. I am no longer playing the game of not daring to speculate. People who say, leave the little girl and her family alone, don't really care about the victim or her family at all. To not talk about her is to play into the government's hands. I hope and pray that I am wrong about the things I say about this little girl. I hope she will make a full recovery. I hope to God, for the sake of her family, that she does. But I don't think she will, and I've thought this all along. And I think it because she's a tiny girl attacked with a 14-inch knife. She was likely the first victim, and therefore nobody was shielding her from her attacker. Her injuries were extensive enough to have put her in intensive care, indicating her injuries are life-threatening. She has been in hospital for around 9 weeks, and most of that time has been spent in ICU. She has now returned back to ICU, and this indicates a massive deterioration in her condition. Paramedics used an AED machine on the victim. According to AED Ireland, if a patient is defibrillated within 5 minutes, survival rates are approximately 50% and potentially higher with younger patients. But if time to defibrillation is 10 minutes or more, virtually no one survives without cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Survival rates subsequently increase by only 10 to 20% if CPR is used, following an incident where the time to AED defibrillation is 10 minutes or more. Given the proximity of the incident to the Rotunda Hospital, it is possible she was defibrillated before 10 minutes had passed. However, that this little child even needed this intervention indicates cardiac arrest due to massive blood loss. Massive blood loss causes a loss of oxygen to the brain and results in tissue damage of the brain, and this can result in brain damage and possibly a vegetative state. It was reported that the child's mother had stated that the little girl had smiled, and many were seen to rejoice on social media, thinking she was about to make what they thought was a full recovery. Yet smiling is not uncommon in a vegetative state. It is likely this poor mother lives in a state of eternal hope, as we all would in that situation. It is also likely that her traumatised and vulnerable state has been used to the best advantage by the government. There have been reports and speculation that the mother is a migrant herself, and it is easy to imagine how the state could manipulate someone who may have a language barrier or may have an open-ended asylum application. She will have been surrounded by a team of people, some no doubt savvy in public relations. As for her daughter, I am aware of some of the specific injuries the child is alleged to have sustained, such as head, chest and neck injuries. It is difficult to imagine a very small child could recover from or survive such injuries to critical areas of the body. Take a look at any 5-year-old you know and you will see you can place your hand around the circumference of their neck. Their thin-skinned chests are tiny and free of padding, as is the heart contained underneath the delicate bones within, and their heads are infinitely more fragile than an adult head. It did happen in winter time, so they could have been wearing thick coats and that may have helped. I am also aware that witnesses say the child had an unnatural grey pallor before entering the ambulance. Additionally, there has been a lack of consistent updates indicating that there was nothing good to report, and also indicating they would like the public to forget about this child and make it as though she never existed. Now that they are all of a sudden updating us with bad news should indicate that there is a possibility they are prepping the public for worse news. This return to ICU was splashed all over the front of one of the papers yesterday. There'll be those in the comments, of course, who will say I'm not a doctor, and to them I would say absolutely nobody needs a medical degree to draw the conclusion that things do not look hopeful for this child. And the harsh truth is that for the current establishment, this little girl, someone's daughter, presents a problem for them. She doesn't matter to them as a human being, or at least she only matters insofar as she presents a dilemma. They wish this problem child would just be forgotten. They can't just make her leave the public consciousness, however, and the only way in which she will cease to exist is if she loses her life, which makes the government fearful because of the public reaction. To the government, her dominant status is not that she is a human child, but rather, as I said at the beginning, she is a thing or an object. To them, she represents nothing more than a potential flashpoint for public unrest they may not be able to contain. She may create the spark that sets this country ablaze. They know that this may be a catalyst which pushes things to the tipping point. If the little girl tragically does die or spends the rest of her life in a vegetative state, that will make many looking around their small communities see the potential threat that may just be lurking amongst the hundreds of idle, unvetted men dumped beside or close to where their children play or go to school. These same people may start to be unnerved by the fact that many of these small towns have no police station, or if they do, they may only open for a couple of hours a day and be manned by no more than 1 or 2 Gardaí. They may too start to think about how the nearest hospitals may be a whole county away and how emergency services may not be around the corner when needed. If that Algerian man, Riyad Bouchaiker, had have attacked children in a small town, what would the outcome have been? Who would have been there to stop him from stabbing more children than he did? We know from news reports outlining his preliminary court appearances that he was specifically after children, as he is charged with 3 counts of attempted murder in relation to the child victims, but was not charged with attempted murder in relation to the extensive and serious injuries caused to creche worker Leanne Flynn. This would indicate they know his attack on the children was premeditated and that they can prove that, but they cannot prove that he planned to kill Miss Flynn. Rather, it would appear she simply got in the way of his intended targets. What was in Mr. Bouchaiker's past before he came to Ireland? And will this emerge if there is a trial? Mr. Bouchaiker last appeared in court on Thursday the 25th of January. It emerged the book of evidence is not ready given the size of the file and amount of exhibits and medical evidence. An adjournment of 4 weeks was agreed upon, but the prosecution could not confirm that the file would be ready at the next hearing. The book of evidence must be served on Mr. Bouchaiker before a trial date can be set, and undoubtedly the state will be hoping for a guilty plea, so as details never emerge regarding Bouchaiker's past. But what they cannot manipulate or hide for much longer is the narrative around the little girl. I don't think people will buy the latest obvious attempts to manipulate them, and I hope for the government's sake people do not look into just how many Algerian males have been let in here with no checks whatsoever, or notice how often they pop up on sexual crime statistics in other European countries. In Sweden, studies show Algerian men are 122 times more likely to commit aggravated rape than native Swedes. The reason for this may be because, in addition to a lack of background checks, countries like Algeria may be encouraging the migration of predatory criminals such as these. Governments are known to do this. In 2022, it was reported that Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro emptied prisons of violent criminals, including murderers and rapists, and sent them to the southern border of the USA. And so it's possible some countries could be ridding themselves of criminals and passing them on to us. In addition, having no checks here is encouraging criminals to arrive on our shores where they will go undetected. The government had also better hope that people do not realise that Algeria is awash with Islamic terror groups and radicalisation, with some people leaving Algeria carrying criminal records pertaining to brutal jihadist crimes. In Algeria, both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, as well as other Islamic groups, are quite active, but the country is generally safe for natives. The country is lacking in economic opportunity, but other than that, there isn't really anything else that should be bringing people here. Interestingly, Algeria is very keen to control its own borders and has been criticised for mass deportations of non-Algerian Africans to neighbouring countries like Mali, without considering the legal status of said immigrants, and anger is growing amongst the public due to a rise in Chinese immigrants. In terms of natives migrating out of Algeria, it is true to say there may be some Algerian terrorists fleeing the consequences of some very serious crimes, such as involvement in massacres that took place during the Civil War, which started in the 1990s and ended in 2002. This was known as the Black Decade. The Civil War began after a more liberal way of life, but in the late 80s, Islamist parties appeared. We don't know if people who carried out those massacres are in our country. During the 1990s, whole villages were killed and people witnessed babies murdered. Teachers and journalists were also slaughtered, and state security forces killed indiscriminately, failing to properly identify those who carried out the massacres, and instead they targeted innocent civilians. So this means that the people who carried out the massacres may never have been held to account and could be anywhere now. That time has thankfully passed for that country, and it's not in a state of civil unrest anymore and hasn't been for over 2 decades. The last war, aside from the Civil War, ended over 60 years ago in 1962 when Algeria fought for its independence. During that war, which began in the 1950s, the French military is said to have carried out a brutal regime of torture and rape against Algerian citizens, and also carried out extrajudicial executions and slaughtered natives frequently. Some may argue France has some moral obligation to take in some amount of Algerians, given that the war is relatively recent in historical terms, although I'm sure many French people would strongly contest any suggestion that they are responsible for Algerians, and they have taken in a lot of them. That is an argument relating to colonialism and reparations for another time, but either way, at the very least, it would be fair to say that Ireland has even less of a moral obligation than France, that's for sure. We have not colonised any country, and rather have been colonised and occupied ourselves. Furthermore, as a country with 5.3 million people, we can only absorb so many people. A country like France, with 65 million people, can absorb much more than we can. Also, it's likely that some of the Algerians arriving here are not even coming directly from Algeria, but rather from countries like France. In 2022, Emmanuel Macron was questioned about his handling of deportation orders after 12-year-old Lola Daviette was murdered by an Algerian woman who had been ordered to deport prior to the killing. This shocked and outraged the French public due to the brutal and sexual nature of the crime, as well as the deportation order that should have been carried out. In 2023, 2 Algerians were charged with the rape of an 83-year-old woman after they broke into her apartment. These crimes are not isolated incidents, and Macron reluctantly admitted in 2023 that over half of all crime in France is committed by migrants, despite them being a minority of the population. And prior to that, not long before that, he had actually denied that there was a link between crime and immigration, just like Leo Varadkar has. But returning now back to Algeria as a country, I would say there are many in this North African country who lived through very bleak times during the 1990s, and some still bear the psychological scars from those days. And while this is to be pitied, it is not cruel or uncaring, but rather it is common sense that the best way to help such people would not be to put them in high stress, high conflict environments such as cramped hotel rooms, industrial units or office blocks where they have nothing to do all day. And suffice to say, in this country, adequate mental health supports will not be provided, nor will adequate integration be a priority for this government, nor would it be for a Sinn Féin one. Addictions, loneliness and health problems, both mental and physical, will abound, and how can this be good for anyone? Furthermore, jobs in these small rural towns will not be readily available for those who do wish to secure employment because our tourism industry has been destroyed. There is also no incentive to secure employment for fear of losing accommodation or benefits, and even if well-paid employment was attained or is attained, there is little prospect of finding independent accommodation, and perhaps even less of a chance of most of these men finding partners for a multitude of reasons. So while some may have suffered in Algeria's civil war, this is nonetheless in the country's past. It's not their present, and we don't have the capacity to help these people, and we do need to help our own, which we haven't been doing. While some of these men may be worthy of empathy, they are nonetheless, by and large, economic migrants who do not fit the criteria for refugee status through the asylum application process, and by virtue of that, most, if not all, should be denied. While I realise this may sound harsh, it is not a reflection of callousness, but rather an acknowledgement that we cannot house everyone in the world with trauma or sadness in their background. After all, most people have some degree of both, and people react better or worse to that depending on individual resilience. But we should not be taking in extremely vulnerable people whose mental health will only likely deteriorate in conditions that are ripe only for the profit-making of greedy white-collar human traffickers who treat these migrants as sources of endless money, and in that regard, these people are treated like things. The fallout of it all, of course, will never be felt by those profiteering crooks who are ensuring Irish communities are drowning in waters where perhaps more than the occasional shark may now be hiding. But in going back to my point on the trauma of strangers, it is also important to say it is possible to feel compassion for vulnerable people with mental health difficulties or other troubles, while also recognising that at the very least, a small minority of those people may represent a potential danger to those around them. And when it comes to mental health issues, we usually do strive to do our best for those in our own circle of life, but that's all we can do or should be expected to do. On occasion, when we meet someone we do not know who has some difficulty, we may, in that moment, try to help them and show kindness where we can. For example, when a stranger asks us for spare change, we may give it. If a distressed person is crying on a park bench, we may ask them if they are okay. Or if an alcoholic falls over on the street, we'll help them up and might even arrange for them to get home. But what we don't do is house them, give them our tax money, displace ourselves for these strangers. We move on because our responsibilities lie elsewhere. This is healthy, this is normal, these are important and necessary boundaries for our own survival in life. Yet we are made to feel as though this is selfish. So sinister agendas can be carried out while we're busy questioning whether or not we are good people. The truth is, being capable of taking on the problems of all those we don't know from other countries is not far-right, racist or xenophobic, and if we are to help anyone, it should primarily be children. And our own people, of course. For a government to expect us to take on the responsibility of an endless number of people, especially in relation to those who are from outside this country, is a monumental abdication of their duties towards us and is an astonishing abuse of their powers. Moreover, they are, for all intents and purposes, imposing a communist collective attitude upon us, one that asks us not even to be only responsible for our own society around us, but to be responsible for what they deem to be a global community. We must endeavour to reject this wholeheartedly, as it is why we are seeing incidents happen like the one in Parnell Square, which will sadly not be the last of its kind. And in terms of Algerians and other nationalities, there will be people who will be fleeing the consequences of something they've done. This is undeniable fact. Some of which, in terms of predominantly Muslim countries like Algeria, will inevitably, on the balance of probabilities, be related to Islamic acts of terror or radicalisation, as I've previously mentioned. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but it's a point worth repeating. It could just be a very tiny number, but we've no way of knowing because no one is vetting anyone, despite Leo Varadkar's proclamations of thorough background checks. And a tiny number is enough to potentially change many lives. And as we've pointed out many times before, if you knew you could escape a criminal record or criminal charges by going to a relatively prosperous country, wouldn't you do it? Wouldn't you welcome the no questions, no passport needed, lax approach? Wouldn't you welcome the assistance you would receive on arrival? But you wouldn't necessarily leave behind your criminality, especially if you were a sexual predator or a radical. The Department of Justice has been forced to admit that it does not carry out background checks, as to do so means contacting the applicant's government, therefore alerting that government to the whereabouts of a person who may be fleeing a regime within their country of origin. Varadkar also says applicants are checked against Eurodac and the Schengen Information System, but neither of these are criminal databases. Furthermore, the Department of Justice recently confirmed that An Garda Síochána does not input fingerprints on the Europol information system. Until recently, this basic but vital information has been deliberately kept hidden from the public. FOIs by members of the public to ascertain clarity on background checks were repeatedly denied. FOI requests put forward by the Irish Inquiry were also denied. The reason given was that we are not accredited press, which gives rise to the question, why have the mainstream press not presented this information regarding background checks to the public, given that they are privy to the truth behind these matters? The clarity regarding checks was presented to the public by Gript after Carol Nolan and Michael McNamara used their respective powers as TDs to force the Department of Justice to come clean. No other accredited publication published this information, despite it being in the public interest of every single person living in the Irish state, migrants included. What also became clear from those FOI responses is that in any case, Algeria, along with Nigeria, do not subscribe to European database systems whatsoever, so even if Europol was used, we would nonetheless be in the dark about anyone coming in from these two countries, and that is why that little girl is in ICU this evening and not at home with her family where she belongs. This little girl may never go home again. But either way, in summary, the timing of the update on her condition is not coincidental, not without agenda, and it is not insignificant. And the government's supposed crackdown on Algerian asylum applications, when viewed in light of this, is undeniably suspicious. As well as being about saving their skins, it is all for show, as in reality nothing has or will change, as many people as before will still arrive from Algeria. They will still be able to make asylum applications, and the government will still not process those applications for years in all likelihood. Adding Algeria to the list of safe countries effectively changes nothing, and using the move to manage the public's reaction to this child's gravely ill state is a new low point for this malignant cancer of a government and their media accomplices. Without irony, they pass themselves off as altruistic humanitarian champions who are better than you or I will ever be, and yet they have no regard for this little girl and the catastrophic injuries she has suffered. They have thoroughly dehumanized her at every possible opportunity, and they will be the same when it comes to any other child who falls victim to terror and violence because of their actions. And with that, I will leave you with an apt quote by writer Terry Pratchett. Evil begins when you begin to treat people as things.